Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back to the program Matthew Hoh. Is the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network. Matt's a disabled Marine Corps combat veteran, and in 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest over the escalation of that war. Matt, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me back on with you, Eleanor.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure. So, Matt, I wanted to speak to you specifically today about a recent trip that you took. You were in occupied Palestine and Israel. I was wondering, like, just to start off, if you could give a brief rundown of the itinerary and the purpose of that trip, and then we can get into specifics of what you experienced and saw there.
Yeah, thanks. It was in November. I was there for 8 days, uh, and we spent almost all of our time in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. We met with, every day was full. We met with former prisoners. We met with families who had had their homes destroyed, families of those who've been killed. We've met with activists, with professors, with lawyers, with economists, with business leaders. We met with religious leaders, priests, pastors, imams, rabbis. We met with October 7th survivors, Israeli peace activists. So we had a really broad and robust, I guess I should say, itinerary. And again, most of the time was in the occupied West Bank. Our hotel was in East Jerusalem. We were in Ramallah. We were in Hebron. We were in Nablus. We couldn't get to any of the smaller villages. We attempted to go to some more rural places, but every time we tried to do, the Israelis had closed the roads. So we got a taste for what it's like to have to live with that, to deal with that. Just give you an example. One time, the stretch of road the Israelis closed was about 100 meters. That's all it was. It just closed two gates on the end of a connection, essentially. And it took us about 50 minutes to make the detour. It took about 50 minutes to wrap around to get back to that other side of the 100 meters. And that's constant over there. And that's just one aspect of what the occupation is like, that constant strangulation, right? I mean, we met with a priest in Nablus. He and his wife, they hold separate identity cards, and they have a daughter. And because she was born in Israel as a Palestinian, and he was born in the West Bank, they have separate identity cards. So that means they can't travel together. And then with the type of the checkpoints, the road closures, to take their daughter to get vaccinations, they have to spend the whole day. It's about a 7-hour trip just to go to the doctor for their little girl. And this is a priest living in Nablus, a major city, second biggest city, I think. We had a lot of those experiences where you just understood what the constant suffocation was like under occupation, and the constant humiliation. And the humiliation, I think, is a thing that comes up over and over again for the Palestinians. I mean, certainly the violence, the economic, theft, all of that. But there's the humiliation. To give you an example, we were in Hebron and we were by the Abraham Mosque, and in quieter times, of course, there's a lot of traffic there, people visiting, etc. There's almost nobody there. Jerusalem is a ghost town, and the West Bank is even less than Jerusalem is in terms of seeing internationals there, in terms of seeing people like you and I there. So in Hebron, where you would normally see, or have been before, you would normally see internationals, they hadn't seen internationals in months. The Israeli soldiers and the border police that I spoke with there hadn't seen anyone who looked like me in a very long time. That's why the border police called me over and took my passport and went through it and everything, because they had no idea who I was and what I was doing there. The young Israeli soldier I spoke with, and this is heartbreaking because the kid was, 6 months out of high school, about 110 pounds, soaking wet. Like in the Marine Corps, we used to describe kids like this as, being so dumb they're happy. That type of that type of boyish energy, and just the kid standing there in a corner carrying a rifle. And all you can think talking to him is like, I don't want this kid to ever get hurt or killed. And I certainly ever don't want this kid to get killed and hurt. And so you see a lot of that as well, that what the occupation has done to the Israelis in terms of this kid should just be caring about like playing video games, where he's going to buy marijuana from, and the girl he likes, or the boy he likes, or whatever. I mean, like that should be his whole life right now. It shouldn't be, standing post occupying Hebron. And then as he was talking to me, some settler drives up and starts yelling at him. So the poor kid probably got in trouble for talking to me. But anyway, our Palestinian friend who was with us there in Hebron, because we're near the Abraham Mosque, there are like public toilets. And we, as foreigners, were allowed to go use the toilets. He, as a Palestinian, was not. So you see the way that apartheid system, it's meant to do a lot of things, but one of it is just humiliation. Like, no, you're going to hold it, or you can either wet your pants or hold it, but you're not going to use that toilet with your fellow human beings here because you don't. So, that's what it was like, throughout the week we were there. Just whether collecting data and information from people we're talking to, or just like these anecdotal experiences, just to really put together a picture of what is happening in the West Bank and what we can expect to happen in the next couple of years, which of course is the annexation. We did get down to an Israeli town, a settlement right next to Gaza called Serot. This is where we met some rabbis, October 7th survivors. And we then from there, we were able then to go to look at Gaza. And we went to essentially what was an observation platform, a permanent structure, had been there for about 15 years, essentially allows Israelis to go and look into Gaza like you're looking into a zoo, essentially looking at these caged people. And certainly when there have been past air campaigns, past military operations in Gaza, this would be full of people watching the airstrike, say. And so over the last year, you have this occurring where people go to watch the genocide. And we were about 600 yards from the fence line, probably about the closest you could have gotten to it that day. And about another 2,000 yards or so to the built-up areas of northern Gaza. So I think we were probably closest to Jabalia, a refugee camp, or maybe Bethlehem. Should go back and look at the map. And but anyway, you couldn't see anything. I mean, we were close enough, 2,500 yards, so you're talking about mile and a half, essentially. You should be able to see the outlines of 3, 4, 5-story buildings, right? So this is a clear, beautiful day. And you couldn't see any of that. There was just rubble, and there was a haze, and there was smoke. What you could see was massive clouds of dust and dirt being kicked up by what likely was Israeli earth-moving equipment. It could have been their tanks and armored vehicles, but there was so much. It looked like what you would get from a massive construction site. And this earth-moving equipment was essentially, making Gaza into Israel's image. And the same day we were there, uh, uh, shoot, Weiss is her last name, forgetting her first name, but prominent settler, Daniela Weiss, prominent settler, maybe the most prominent settler in Israel, was at the Gaza border holding a press conference. She had brought 40 trailers or caravans down here with her and saying, within the year, we will be back in Gaza. And then the following week, she made an announcement that she had 750 families prepared to go into Gaza. And so you could see all that happening in front of you with that huge dust cloud. That's essentially what it represented, was Israel preparing the next phase of their operation in Gaza, which is concentration camps for the few remaining in the north, the people who have not been pushed, ethnically cleansed out of northern Gaza, concentration camps for them, and a resettlement for the Israeli settlers in Gaza. And then south of what's called the Netzarim corridor, which is roughly 2/3, 3/4 of the way north in Gaza, which is where the vast majority of the population is now. You can expect that a year from now, Eleanor will be having the same conversations. There's nothing to say anything is going to change. That a year from now, I expect it's going to be the same stories about how only 30 aid trucks got in, how another baby froze to death, how another 5 healthcare workers were murdered by the Israelis. It'll be the same stories because Israelis don't seem to have a plan for that southern part of Gaza, uh, aside from we're going to worry about it later. We've taken care of the north. Our focus is now the West Bank, and we'll just continue to do what we're going to do in the southern part of Gaza. The hope that the Egyptians or the Jordanians will let people in, or these ocean liners are going to show up and take Palestinians off to South America or something like that. I think that percolates in their minds, but they really don't care. I think they're fine with where they're at right now. They're in control. They've gotten what they want. They've more or less ethnically cleansed the north. They control the south of Gaza, and they know they have the backing of the Americans to continue doing whatever they want. And so, the one aspect about being there looking at Gaza, I think that really affected myself and those I was with, because we're expecting to look into this genocide. And so you have all these confused feelings about being a voyeur and what are you doing there and everything. But then the other aspect is you're not going to be able to see anything. But you're expecting to witness a horror. But there was this other thing that happened while we were there. Um, as we're looking into Gaza, these teenagers come running up the hill up to this observation platform. And this observation platform, again, it's a permanent structure. It's got the big metal binoculars that you put 5 shekels into, and you can, just like you're at Niagara Falls or something like that. And these teenagers, the first ones up the hill were boys, came rushing up the hill. They're probably 15 or so, and when they saw Gaza, they got very excited and they started to celebrate and they started to pump their fists and they started to give Gaza the middle finger. And then the remainder of their classmates showed up. And this was a school field trip that had been brought down to Gaza from 2.5 hours away to witness the genocide, to watch what was going on there. So you see this aspect of the genocide as entertainment as well. It functions, of course, that occupation, that apartheid, that Jewish supremacy, of course, has its structure all throughout Israeli society, including an education system, as we know. But I think there's also this aspect of entertainment, right? The destruction of the other as entertainment, the destruction of your enemy, the victory as something to be celebrated. And that's what those school kids were there on this school field trip doing. And so there is a horror with that I don't think any of us, and most of us, have been to Palestine before. Some of the people I was with had lived there for decades, and it was really quite shocking to witness that in in person, to witness that type of school field trip to celebrate the genocide happening right in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, as I have said several times in the course of this past year and some months, is that I love words and they fail me daily. I I remember seeing that you had posted a picture about that observation deck, and I wanted to ask you because you said that you met with people, October 7th survivors. I'm assuming these are Israeli survivors and not Palestinian
Right,
survivors.
right.
What kind of stories did you get from them, and what kind of understanding do they have, and then therefore you have, about what happened that day?
It was very frustrating for those for those of us who met with them. It started off well, and we were pleased that they would meet with us. I should say the group I was with us with an organization called Sabeel, which is a Christian liberation organization. So majority, I'm not very religious, but everyone else was, and but so a lot of religious leaders, a lot of people very steeped in theology, particularly liberation theology. And so we were from the UK, from Canada, and from the US. And we were very pleased to meet with them. And um, the problem is that the things that were initially said, we were for a ceasefire on October 8th. I've been part of a peace organization. I've worked with Palestinians. The one lady, she would you hear stories about the Israelis who drive to the border of Gaza and they pick up a cancer patient and drive them to the hospital, and do that type of work and try to have perform that charity, if you will. And I think do have a sincere desire for peace, but it doesn't go past that. The examination of why do you have to pick this person up from the hospital and drive them from the border and drive them to a hospital is absent from the conversation. And when you got to what was occurring in Gaza now, it was as if there was a line that they refused to cross. This idea that their identity as Jews and the history that informs that identity to accede to and understand the Jewish state, the Israeli state, was carrying out this genocide was something that was too much for them, as if it was a line that they crossed, or if it was a door that they opened in their mind that once it was open, it could never be closed. And that's really how I took their refusal to accept at all the idea that what was going on in Gaza was a genocide, that these were deliberate war crimes being carried out to exterminate or ethnically cleanse Gaza. It was all in the lines of this is war, war is terrible, both sides are bad, the Palestinians need to kick Hamas out, like all these various excuses to the point that it seemed as if they were almost saying that nothing was going on in Gaza aside from typical normal military occupation. And, I actually asked the question then because I knew the answer, but, because I asked, can you hear the airstrikes? And of course they could hear the airstrikes just 7 kilometers away. You know how loud a 2,000 pound bomb is, but I asked that question because it was getting so ridiculous. The way that they were weaving, contorting themselves, doing everything they could to not acknowledge the reality of what was presently happening 7 kilometers from them. So it was very frustrating for us to have those conversations. Grateful they were willing to do so, but you also see that if these are the people who are willing to speak like this, and they are a very slim minority in Israel, and they have no political power whatsoever. Um, what does this say about the rest of the Israeli state, the Israeli society? And we certainly saw that. We had one rabbi who was with us who was very open, very honest, had a lot of integrity, and he did a good job explaining Israeli society for us and gave us some examples that were coming out of the Hebrew language media, which is, of course, very much different than the English language Israeli media that many of us consume. So Haaretz or Plus 972, that's, you know, uh, that's essentially like reading Truth Out or Counterpunch and thinking it's, the perspective of, mainstream Americans or, mainstream American media. So, it was a frustrating conversation because the Israelis would go up to that line, but they wouldn't cross it, or they wouldn't look at what was actually occurring there. Um, so, yeah, so
It reminds me a little bit of when you were talking about like the opening the door and then you can't close it. It sounds a bit like conversations that we've had, but also conversations that I've had like with other veteran friends. One in particular, also a Marine, who was in my band at one point, and he left the band initially because of an anti-war song, and then years later said that he got back in touch with me and basically said like, I'm sorry, I it was too hard for me to accept the truth of what I had gone to war for, and
Mhm.
so I didn't dare look at it honestly. And then finally, like, I've been able to. And of course, he said it's been very psychologically traumatic to do so, but it kind of reminds me of that, like, if you have to accept that your whole existence relies on the genocide, like your comfortable existence relies on genocide and apartheid, like that's really heavy. And I think a lot of people just
Right.
don't want to accept it. It
Yeah.
feels a bit similar in that way.
It absolutely is. It's a form of moral injury. This, it's like your identity is not what you have believed it to be. That the foundations upon who you explain yourself as are rotten, or corrupt, or illegitimate. You have, examples. Yes, certainly with members of the American military. The idea that you have the white hat on and you realize you don't have a white hat on, you have a black hat on, and then it's for me, it was this idea that, well, my generation will be different. And I certainly understood what happened in Central America and Vietnam and, on and on and on, Philippines and Mexico and Native Americans and slavery and all that, right? But my generation is different. And this continuous line of history is, we are removed from it, that it's not a continuous line of history. And then you come to understand that it is. And I think for the Israelis we met, that moral injury was clear to them, that if we accept that what we're doing here makes us no different than those who did the same to us, then who are we as a people? Then how are we special? Then how are we separate from the others? And then what gives us any type of where's what validity, credibility, or legitimacy as a people, and particularly if you believe you're God's chosen people and you're no different than the others, how does that work? How does that add up? It doesn't. So there was that uh, you could see as if again it was like a line they wouldn't cross or a door they wouldn't open. They go right up to it, but then you could see the fear almost coming out of them of having to have that encounter with this conversation. They were very uncomfortable with it, and they were willing to meet with us. And for most Israelis, I mean, what you saw with the in terms of in Israel itself, because we were foreigners and we had a chartered van and everything, and we could go on the Israeli only road, so we
Hmm.
for us, the apartheid system worked pretty well, right? I mean, the roads, the Israeli roads are modern and they're no potholes and, et cetera, et cetera, and then you look over, you see the Palestinian road and it's one level above a dirt road, essentially, and again, all the things we were talking about earlier with the where they close the roads, where they block the roads, it's all meant to make life incredibly difficult for the Palestinians. But, so you could see that as you drove past it, of course. But as you're driving through parts of Israel, as we would go to say from when we left Sderot in the Gaza border, we went to Bethlehem, and so it is you could see that there was no the war wasn't present. What you might see is you might see yellow balloons or yellow flags for the hostages. You go. I remember going through a roundabout through a traffic circle, and there were chairs, yellow chairs set out with the pictures of the hostages on it. Other than that, there was very little conversation about the war, as I could see and as I could hear from others who were watching the Hebrew language, Israeli media. And the conversation, if there was, it was about the hostages divorced. And so if there's a conversation about ending the war from the Israelis, it was not about ending the war with any type of resolution in mind. It was about ending the war so the hostages can come back and then we could resume the war, whatever happens. It's essentially what you had in the window of conversation regarding Gaza and the Palestinians for the Israelis among anything of any political significance. So certainly you have your minorities, you have your fringes, you have people who speak this way and would agree with us who are Israelis. But anyone of political significance, it was essentially the window was military occupation to ethnic cleansing. That was where the discussion was. That's the dialogue that's present in Israel regarding Gaza. And even at this point in November, Gaza was fourth or fifth in terms of conversations among Israelis. Even with the hostages, it was about what was happening in Lebanon. It was about, of course, the in domestic Israeli politics, the corruption of Benjamin Netanyahu. It was about Iran's nuclear program constantly being recirculated. I mean, so you saw that as this genocide was occurring, you could drive to the genocide, see no signs of anything. Beautiful drive through fields and a beautiful day. You would never expect. It was almost like you would do it in a movie, right? Have that type of bucolic approach into this hell, because that's what it was like. And then, but certainly with the West Bank, where we spent, almost all of our time, the reality there for the Palestinians, of course, completely different than what the Palestinians in Gaza are enduring. But that you see the Israeli goal of an annexed West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as they call it, is within sight. As you hear this from Israelis throughout their media, their politicians, their former generals, whoever. This is the best opportunity we've had in 50 years, and we have to take advantage of it. And there's doesn't seem like there's any reason to think they won't do that. And certainly, what we have seen in the last few months with the removal of Hezbollah from the battlefield, the decapitation of its leadership, the collective punishment of the Lebanese people, what we just witnessed in the last month in Syria, the check, the checking, the deterring of both Israel and Iran with each other. Possible Israel, once the Trump administration goes in, may want to attack Iran again, but I just don't see the benefit to them to do that because their goal is the West Bank. That's their priority. It always has been. And so even the destruction of Gaza is a supporting effort for eventual annexation of the West Bank. And so now that they have essentially destroyed Gaza, that they have taken Hezbollah off the battlefield, Assad is gone. That link between Hezbollah and Iran is severed. Uh, Iran and Israel have basically checked one another. They both can fire a ton of missiles at each other's cities, kill a lot of their civilians, but it won't accomplish anything, and they both know that. The Israelis, I should caveat that where I think, Eleanor, the Israelis may launch a strike may want to conduct strikes against Iran once the Trump administration comes in, hoping that the Americans will pick up the bulk of that action, right? So hopefully that the Americans will pick up the bulk of the military operation against Iran. In this way, again, they can continue to concentrate on the West Bank. You've seen that the Israelis have just announced the creation of 5 new reserve brigades for men and women 38 to 58 years old. So I could be in one of these brigades. The idea being, right, they need manpower. They need people. And we can have these people in their 40s and 50s manning checkpoints while the younger men and women are on the streets, kicking doors, shooting Palestinian resistance fighters, shooting Palestinian civilians, as they move forward with their West Bank annexation. And that's one thing too that really saw was we hear a lot about the settlers and what the settlers are doing in the West Bank, and of course, all of that is true in their actions. But when you look at the data, the vast majority of the violence against the Palestinian people in the West Bank is coming from the Israeli military. The Israelis have killed about 900 Palestinians since October 7th of last year. They killed 400 or so prior to October 7th, including 50 children prior to October 7th in 2023. So 50 kids shot dead by the IDF in the West Bank from January to October of 2023, before October 7th. So we had been witnessing that occurring. But the violence by the IDF you can't compare it to Gaza, but it is constant and it is effective and it's demoralizing. And one of the things I came away from having been there before and knowing Palestinians was how many Palestinians were speaking about leaving, particularly men and women with children, people with families, something I hadn't heard before, because the reality is there. The idea that they should have hope, it's easy for us to say, but the reality is iron and steel. And that's what they're faced with. And so you could see how the Israelis will carry this out. My belief is that they'll conduct operations in we're called areas B and C, so the rural parts of the West Bank, this the smaller towns and villages, like they did in Gaza, and ethnically cleanse those rural areas. They'll isolate the cities and essentially hope to see the cities die on the vine. And certain places like Jenin, which they absolutely hate, the Israelis hate Jenin, they hate Nablus, they will treat those cities the way they've treated Khan Yunis and Gaza City and Rafah to a degree. And I think that's what we'll see the annexation look like in these next couple of years. That reality is there. I had spoke with one Palestinian woman. She was actually the author of the Amnesty International report that came out a month or so ago saying this is genocide that's occurring in Gaza. And you ask her, she talked about radical acts of hope. And, I said, can you define that for me? What are radical acts of hope? And she talked about the farmers in Gaza who still go into the fields to try and grow food for their people, and the Israelis murder them. The fishermen who try to get out to sea to catch food for their, and the Israelis murder them. The municipal workers who try and get the water turned on or stop the sewage from spilling, and the Israelis murder them. And so even all these hopes, these radical acts of hope, as to, all end in death, right? I mean, and that's the reality for the Palestinians. We've seen that, of course, in Gaza for the last 14 months, and that's what's coming for the Palestinians in the West Bank. And there doesn't seem to be anything that's going to stop that. There's no Deus ex machina, right? That's going to show up to change things. We don't see it, And the Palestinians feel betrayed. They feel abandoned. They're very grateful for you and I and all the folks who are doing what we can, for our solidarity. but they also understand that the reality is that that doesn't change anything. That doesn't in the mechanics, the mechanics of the day, and the reality of iron and steel. It doesn't change anything. I just went to Ireland, and after I was in Palestine, I went to Ireland, and Irish are far ahead of most in terms of their government's actions towards Israel. So much that Israel threw a big hissy fit and they closed their embassy in Dublin. But you talk to the Irish about it, and the Irish are uh, they're very clear. Look, yeah, so they make statements and they say things, and we have these big marches, and the Israelis get all upset, and we have members of the Dow who say things and everything. But the reality is that our trade with Israel is still really strong. And in Ireland, in the last year, the trade of dual-use goods, so items that could be used for both commercial and military purposes, has increased from Ireland to Israel sevenfold in the last year. So even as Israel closes its embassy in Dublin because the Irish are so anti-Semitic and everything else, the trade is there. And I think the best example of this, of course, is with South Africa, who, of course, a year ago began the efforts to charge Israel with genocide in the International Court of Justice. Very necessary, had to have happened. Very grateful that they're doing it, and all these other nations have gone along, have now climbed on board that. But the reality is that South Africa is the biggest exporter of coal to Israel. And Israel's two most important and our two largest power plants are coal-fired power plants, like both 2,700 megawatts, massive plants. So, you see that where, okay, South Africa is leading this effort to hold Israel accountable for its genocide in the world's highest court. At the same time, it's exporting more coal, which is the backbone of Israel's energy supply, than anyone else in the world. And I mean, so the Palestinians understand that, and they see, they see what's happened to Hezbollah, what happened in Syria with the Iranians. The only ones who continue to be on their side are the Yemenis. Um, and so, I'm not saying they're not grateful for the support. They don't. I'm not saying that the solidarity that we express is not important. It is. It's what's holding them up. They'll tell you that, but they just also have to accept the reality of what's occurring and the reality of what's likely to come in the next year or two or three.
Yeah, and I think I think it's important to be realistic and not try to paint things with a romantic or a Hollywood brush. Um,
Right.
and Matt, we're basically out of time, but I wanted to ask you right before we leave with just a couple of minutes left, because of your experience, with the military and understanding what's going on with Israel and that they're like on so it seems like they're on so many fronts and
Hmm.
their economy is struggling, even though, things are they're still getting their coal and things like that. So do you see anything like did you see anywhere evidence of a country that's in economic trouble that might have to make certain decisions, whether that be like to stop fighting on one of these fronts? Do you see any cracks basically in the apartheid wall, metaphorically?
There are, and Israel certainly is bleeding out economically. Their military is overextended. Reservists don't want to go back. Some, as reported, like in St. Haaretz, don't want to go back because of the crimes of what they're taking part in. But many of them don't want to go back because they're exhausted. And this was an issue you saw between the former defense minister Yoav Gallant and the prime minister. This overextension of the army. The economy is bleeding out. There's all kinds of data that shows that, whether it's the fact that both imports and exports have dropped by 35%, something like close to over 40,000 Israeli businesses have closed. I mean, you see it in all this data that's available. And when you're there, you see it too, Eleanor. Like the hotel we stayed at in East Jerusalem, it had been closed for 10 months before we showed up. And after we were leaving, it was closing again. You'd be in the old city, and there was people weren't there. The stalls and the shops, the vendors for the local folks were open, so the food and the household goods and things like that. But there weren't that many souvenir shops that were open. I mean, we went to the Temple Mount one day. We had a free morning because what happened, we were supposed to meet people, and the Israelis wouldn't let them, Palestinians, they wouldn't let them into Jerusalem. So we ended up having a free morning. So we did some sightseeing. We went to the Temple Mount, which has just people have been unbelievable view of the old city. And this is Friday morning at 10 a.m. Absolutely gorgeous, 70 degrees, blue skies. And we had the whole place to ourselves. There should have been 5,000 other people up there with us. I mean, so you see that very clearly in how are they still surviving then, and why do they have confidence that they can carry this out? It's because of the backing of the United States. So what you've had happen in the last year is Israel has sold 4 times as many bonds as they usually sell. And you look at all the economic numbers, you look at the political chaos, you look at the government, you look at the wars, they're fighting on 7 fronts. The Israeli bond should be terrible. No one should want to buy that. But why are they able to sell so many? Because they have the backing of the United States. The United States has a loan guarantee with Israel that essentially ensures that Israeli debt is backed by the U.S. as their guarantor. So, to put it in simple terms, it's essentially as if you and Lee want to buy a house and you've got Bill Gates or Elon Musk as your co-signer. I mean, like kind of you're going to get what you want. And I'm overly simplifying it, but that's the reality is that for decades, the United States has had these loan guarantees with Israel. A lot of it's got to do with the resettlement of Jews from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, but it extends beyond that. And even if you look at the program itself, there's only about $4 billion that the Congress keeps in a pot for this. But everyone understands that it doesn't matter. The Congress will do whatever it needs to, it will appropriate whatever it needs to support Israel. So this is why Israel is able to remain afloat this way. So even though there are all these cracks, there's a political issue. Certainly within Israel itself, the political tensions, the cultural tensions are very severe. Ronan Bar, who is the head of the Shin Bet essentially is the rough equivalent of the FBI. So the head of Israeli internal security, about 4 months ago, sent a letter to the cabinet saying, look, the biggest threat that we have in Israel is Jewish extremism. The biggest threat that we have in this country is violence from within our own people. And so there's that danger. So of course you have all of that could cause things to collapse. The Israelis are confident that they can get through the next year or two, do what they have to do with the West Bank, and then things will go back to normal. And we've seen that to a degree with reports of the Saudis already talking to the Israelis about normalization. Certainly, they'll have the back of the Americans, and that essentially, I think, is all that they care about, all they should care about. It's all that matters. And that the idea is that we get back to normal in a couple of years. We've annexed the West Bank, we've destroyed Gaza, and people don't care. And it's back to business, and the Christian tour groups show up and they get back on their buses and they can go to the church. It's amazing. If you're a Christian tour group going to Palestine, going to visit, say, Jesus's birthplace, the Church of the Nativity, you can go from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv, from the airport, from Jerusalem, wherever, into Bethlehem without ever seeing the apartheid wall. It's amazing. And so the complicity of all this has always been there. And I think the Israelis are quite confident that the complicity will return. So once people feel safe in going there, it'll go back to normal. And I think that's what they're banking on.
Yeah, well, bleak but honest, and I appreciate that you are. I think again, making it into a Hollywood story is not helpful. So, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your experiences. Thank you for going and being a witness to this. Are there anything else that you'd like to throw in there before we sign off? Anything that you'd like to tell people to keep an eye on?
Certainly there are ways that people can support, and people do need to go there. Everything I said about what matters, the solidarity does matter, and this is what gives them the ability to continue to resist. And they'll say this to you over and over again. So if people are interested in going, you can go to my Substack. It's Matthew Hoh on Substack or whatever it is, and last name spelled Hoh. And in my most recent essay, I include a number of organizations through which you can travel to Palestine to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Or people just reach out directly to me on Twitter or Instagram or whatnot. And I'm happy to share that information because people do need to go. The Palestinians do need the help. Just because this is the reality doesn't mean that resistance ends. It doesn't mean that there's surrender, right? So annexation comes and there's still going to be resistance. There's still going to be that samud, that steadfastness. It's just that the reality is going to be such that to deny it, to come on to your right, Eleanor, and I've had this issue on some other shows where people are upset with me because I'm not hopeful. I feel like I'm lying, right? I'm not going to go there and be with the Palestinians and share with them and hear with them and sit with them and eat with them and then come back and give people false hope. It's not right. It's not fair to them. So hopefully I'm wrong. I mean, that's what I hope. Hopefully I'm wrong.
But again, I think it's important to, you can't address a problem. I think this is what they tell addicts. You can't address a problem until you admit that there is one. So
Yeah, right.
we got to look at things square and address them as such. So Matt, thank you again so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Eleanor. Happy New Year to you.
Likewise.